Hello and welcome back to Catastrophe Chronicles. I'm Katie Babick, your captain of disaster.
And I'm Aaron Babick, here to make sure we don't go overboard on puns.
Today, we're setting sail on the story of the Doña Paz ferry disaster, where the only thing worse than the voyage was the collision.
With over 4,000 lives lost, it's the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster.
So grab a life vest, because this one's a real shipstorm. Hi guys, welcome back. We are so excited to be here as usual.
Absolutely. Thrilled to be doing another one.
Yes. So this week, we're doing a little shipwreck week, which is like Shark Week, but better.
I'm sure there could be sharks involved.
There are definitely sharks involved. Today, we're going to be doing my shipwreck, which is the Doña Paz. And then on Wednesday, on Christmas, we're going to release Aaron's first episode.
Woo!
Dueling shipwrecks. Aaron's doing the Kursk, and I thought it was fun. Aaron's disasters will likely be basically all shipwrecks.
Babies in the blood.
Well, I think it'd be fun to do shipwreck weeks, though, whenever you do a shipwreck disaster. We can do a couple. So hopefully people like that. I think it'll be fun. I hope everyone is having a wonderful holiday season, regardless of what holidays you celebrate.
Happy holidays.
And we're here to bring you chaos and destruction to just lighten the mood a little bit. This episode is going to be coming out on December 20th, and I picked this one for that day because it's the 37th anniversary of the sinking of the Doña Paz.
Oh, wow.
That's what we got going on here. Well, it's interesting
I mean,
anyway.
The timing is cool.
I was glad the timing lined up. I thought that was neat.
So, Katie, tell me, what are we drinking this week?
I found a cocktail called Shipwreck.
Oh, perfect.
And so we made it. It's rum, bourbon, pineapple juice, and lime juice. It's really tasty.
It's beautiful, too.
It's tasty enough that I think anytime we do these fun shipwreck weeks, I'm going to make shipwrecks. I know we didn't do a shipwreck for the Kursk, but that's okay.
Well, we had to do something for the Russians.
The Moscow Mule was perfect. I'm here for it.
Well, I think we did white Russians.
Oh, we did white Russians. That's right. It was delicious, and this is delicious. This is my kind of cocktail, the fruity and bourbony.
It's delicious.
It is. So on that note, to try and get rolling so the episode maybe is a little bit shorter than the last few we've done. This week, the quote is going to be an old maritime proverb. Are you ready for it?
Absolutely.
I'm sure you don't know this one at all. The sea is a cruel mistress.
Yarr.
I think it's pretty fitting for this one because this disaster, not only was the sinking pretty awful, but the sea itself was not kind. Yeah.
She is almost never kind.
She just doesn't care. So
yes,
there's that.
It's true.
So today we are going international again. This disaster happened in the Philippines.
All right.
This disaster was coined by National Geographic as Asia's Titanic.
Ooh.
And when I read that, that's what made me interested in it, because this was another peacetime maritime disaster, but it's the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster that's ever happened. The first thing we need to understand about in general is the Philippines. The Philippines are very much a maritime country. You've been there before, right?
Oh, yeah. Several times.
What part of Philippines did you go to?
We went to a place called Subic Bay.
Okay.
It's about halfway down the Philippines, I'd say. Maybe a little less than halfway down if you're going from the north to the south. It's not the touristy spot like Manila or anything like that. It used to be a U.S. Navy base.
Are there any Navy bases on the Philippines now?
Ships go to Manila fairly often, and they still go to Subic Bay, but it's not like a standing Navy base.
Oh, okay. Good to know. Well, the Philippines are a maritime country because of their geography.
Mm-hmm.
The Philippines are made up of over 7,000 islands, all in an archipelago. So 7,000 islands. Getting between those islands requires ferries. There are not bridges from island to island to island. You can't drive everywhere. You can't walk anywhere. You've got to take ferries. Ferries are very much a just normal part of life in the Philippines.
Have you heard about the little island that's barely a speck of land that China and the Philippines have been fighting over?
I have not.
They claimed this island because there was a shipwreck, a little small fishing boat on it, and they maintain it by sending the Coast Guard out to it.
The Philippines do?
Yeah, to routinely check on it. China is trying to claim it so they can expand their waters.
Well, that ties into the story very much because the Philippines, all the waters around the Philippines are known for like tropical disasters and harsh realities. So shipwrecks they're very, very common in the Philippines. From 1972 to 1987, there was 177 sinkings in just that time period alone.
That's
in the
a lot.
Philippines. It is. And that has to do with a lot of different reasons. The Philippines are prone to typhoons, which are just hurricanes, but with a different name. They have to rely...
I've been there as a typhoon rolled through.
You were there?
We pulled in to avoid the typhoon, so we got like the outskirts of it.
Interesting.
I have never been more wet in my life, even when going swimming.
Interesting.
It was thick.
I'm glad you survived, and I'm glad you didn't tell me about it. I did not hear about that when you were in the Philippines. In the Philippines, the government also has a lot of just aging and obsolete forecasting equipment. So while we in the States know when hurricanes are coming, particularly in the 1980s, a lot of these merchant vessels wouldn't have gotten information because the Philippine government didn't have good access to that information. They weren't great at collecting it. Because of this and a bunch of other things, the Filipinos are really kind of resigned to maritime disasters and to sinkings. Like it's like car wrecks in a lot of other modernized societies. It's par for the course, something that happens in day-to-day life. So the Doña Paz, part of why, even though it was such a horrific disaster with such a high death toll, it's not a really commonly known disaster because it's really just kind of a footnote in a number of other disasters. They're just so common there. It's hard to be particularly interested in just one or two because
numb.
This is just normal. So I was saying before, there was 177 collisions from 1972 to 1987. I'm sorry, there was 177 sinkings from 1972 to 1987. There was also 80 collisions just in the Philippines, 53 ship fires.
That checks out too. I've seen some of the craft.
Right? Over 4,000 deaths from maritime disasters, not including the Doña Paz. Just a few. In 1980, the Don Juan sank with 180 dead, 115 missing. In 1981, the San Juan sank with 52 dead. 1986, the Doña Josephine sank with 150 dead. And that's just a few examples of things that were going on there. They expect shipwrecks. Another reason why these disasters happen so often is the coastline was not super well maintained for ships. In 1987, there was 308 lighthouses on 22,549 miles of coast.
Yeah.
Only half of them worked.
Awesome.
So that's not enough lighthouses in general, and only half of them worked.
There's also a lot of crazy like bottom topography underneath the water there.
Yeah.
So there's some, it gets real shallow real quick in some spots.
Well, I mean,
can run around real easy.
That brings me to, I was going to talk about buoys. Buoys are often used to mark that kind of stuff. When the water, the ocean floor is higher, there might be a buoy there to show that it's higher, or there should be a buoy there to show that it's higher. They also show good paths that are safe for ships to go through.
And updated charts are important too. Well surveyed.
There were 120 buoys that were specifically set out in Philippine waters in 1987.
That's not a lot.
Only 42 of them were actually in the position they were notated to be in. Now, you talk about navigational charts, right? How those are important to be able
very
to
important.
See. The government navigational charts hadn't been updated since 1980. So not only were more than half of everything not working, there were no charts saying this buoy's in the wrong spot. This lighthouse doesn't work. Most of the charts showed is all of these buoys being in the right place, all of these lighthouses being in the right place. They showed what the topography looked like in 1980, which in a storm-prone area changes.
Oh, yeah.
And with that many shipwrecks, that also changes. So if a ship sinks and it's high enough, it's going to cause a danger. These captains were relying on what's called dead reckoning.
Oh, yeah.
Can you explain what dead reckoning is? You'll do a better job than me.
It's essentially straight line, point-to-point navigation. It doesn't take into account set and drift. It doesn't take into account anything other than line of sight.
So what I put in my notes for that was luck and instinct.
Yeah.
That's how I was going to describe it. It's you want to go across the street, and if you're lucky, you get there. If you're not, you don't. And that's how most of these captains were steering. Now, that's not to say that Filipino sailors were not well trained.
No, you get to know your local waters if you're...
Not only that, the Philippines controls nearly 20% of all officer and rated positions in the world's fleets. They have over 180,000 seafarers. And they're pretty overwhelmingly considered well trained and good at what they do, which I think probably has a lot to do with the fact that they don't have good shit. They have to do it by instinct. You have to be good at that instinct, have a good instinct
you're
to
not
survive.
They're not overly reliant on technology.
They can't be.
They got to do it the old-fashioned way.
Exactly. So they're
gotta be good.
Very well regarded world round. And I'm sure you met a number of different Filipino sailors when you were in the Navy and when you were doing other sailing stuff pre-Navy. Like they're their reputation is good. And I want to make sure we say that because a lot of what I'm going to say here about the Philippines is not great. It's not. Most ships in the Philippines, like for domestic shipping, were secondhand cargo and passenger ships, often purchased from like Japan shipyards. Japan would get them new or build them new, use them for a while, and then sell them to the Philippines. Mm-hmm. At this time, on average, ships were 22 years old through the 7 major shipping companies, which seems kind of old to me for a ship. I suppose it depends.
Well, when you look, it depends on how the ship was built, and they're given a rating for the life of the ship, the expected life of the ship. It's about 20 years typically, like Navy ships, like our Navy ships, they're about 20 years. They get extended.
An average age of 20 is on the older end.
I've definitely been on older ships.
And then over 20% of them were over 30 years old. Mm-hmm. So like it's not a new fleet. There's not many new things there. These ships, like I said, they'd be made in Japan, and then they'd be brought over and converted in local shipyards and given new names, and then marketed as luxury passenger ships.
Oh,
right? At least for the ferry boats. I mean, I don't think they were marking the oil tankers as luxury, but the ferry boats were marketed as luxury passenger ships. So the Doña Paz was one of these oldie but goodie ships.
All right.
She was built in 1963 in Japan. She was a steel-hulled liner weighing 2,215 tons. And she was owned by Sulpicio Lines, which was one of the 7 major maritime companies in the Philippines. It was built in Japan, like I said, in Hiroshima, actually, which I thought was interesting. And its original name was, I'm going to say this the best I can, Himiyuri Maru.
Sounds good.
All right, there we go. It's originally only had a capacity of 608, but by the time it was refurbished and put into action in the Philippines, they had upped its capacity to 1,518, crewed by 60.
Pretty big jump.
That's a big jump already. It was acquired by Sulpicio in 1975. 4 years after that, its original name in the Philippines was Don Sulpicio, and it was the flagship for Sulpicio Lines.
Okay.
However, that year, in 1979, it caught on fire. It was catastrophic. The ship was declared a complete and total loss, nearly sank, and was towed away.
Yeah, fire on board
ship fires are scary.
Not good at all.
Just the brief things you've explained about ship fires to me and what I've read, like, you don't want it. And a catastrophic one that wipes the ship out, this is not good news.
Bad.
Nonetheless, Sulpicio Line was not willing to get rid of the ship, so they refurbished it again and put it back out on the water as the Doña Paz.
Not good enough for their flagship anymore.
No, it was no longer the flagship.
But still okay.
Just to put it in your mind, remember this name, the Doña Marilyn became the flagship.
Okay.
Just remember that for later.
Doña Marilyn.
The other ship involved in this collision was the MT Vector. That was a 629-ton ship, and it was crewed by 13 people. This was just a run-of-the-mill oil tanker.
Yeah, but those guys they're big.
They're big, but they don't have a ton of people. They move very slow.
Yep.
This particular ship was carrying around 9,000 tons of gasoline, kerosene, and crude oil.
Woo, okay.
In the Philippines, every ship that sails, and I'm sure this is the case in everywhere, but every ship has to have a certain number of clearances. In the Philippines, they have to go through 8 different agencies. We're only going to talk about a few. The Coast Guard, one of these things they have to clear, they have to get inspected by the Coast Guard every single year and get a certificate of inspection before they're allowed to sail. The Doña Paz had all of her inspections, but the Vector's was 18 months expired, so no inspection. They are also supposed to get radio licenses.
Yep.
The Vector's was expired.
Of course it was.
And the Doña Paz's, it was found later, was a forgery.
That checks.
Just in case you're not picking it up yet, corruption and not thinking things through is a big part of this story.
To illustrate the corruption that exists still, U.S. Navy ship movements are, like, you remember, you're not supposed to talk about them.
Nope.
No one but the workers who are there to receive the ship when they arrive should know that the ship is coming.
Right.
We would have a line, and I mean a line of vendors waiting to sell us stuff outside the gate. As we pulled in, we're like, how'd you know we were going to be here?
We just know.
Someone sold the information.
Someone told someone and got money for it. Yep. So there's 8 agencies that have to give out different certificates, but really the main people in charge of maritime stuff was the Coast Guard, right? The Coast Guard was in charge of a lot of the certificates and enforcement, but it's hard for them to do that because it's a small Coast Guard.
Yep.
The Coast Guard was monitoring 500,000 square miles of territorial waters with 23 World War II vintage boats.
Awesome. And a fair bulk of the world's trade goes through those waters.
And they had 23 World War II age, so even older than these ferry boats, to do all of that work and inspect all of these ships and make sure that ships that were sailing out had their inspections. And like we said, 7,000 islands. Hundreds of ferry boats are going out every day.
Oh, yeah.
It's a near impossible job, but that's what they had to work with. So here we are, December 20th, 1987. The Doña Paz left Tacloban, Leyte Island in the Philippines for the capital of Manila. This was supposed to be a 24-hour voyage, so this is a long trip. It's right before the holidays, so there's tons of people cramming onto this ship. People going to Manila for shopping, to visit family, tons and tons of people. The Doña Paz was a 3-deck ship. On their manifest, they said on those 3 decks, there were 675 passengers that boarded in Tacloban, 908 boarded in Catbalogan, meaning, putting it together, they had a declared passenger list of 1,583.
Okay.
For a ship that's only supposed to have 1,518.
Yep.
But
that's not how many were on board.
Let's talk about how overcrowded Filipino ferry boats are. This is a thing. It's a cultural thing in a lot of these areas that people are much more willing to cram into spaces. But in the Philippines, for ferry boats in particular, it was both cultural and corruption. They would fit literally anyone who could fit on top of each other. They would put entire families on one single bunk because this is a 24-hour cruise. They had bunks.
I'm sure they counted them as one person.
So on the manifest, they just had those people. They counted each one, but there were tons of people that weren't on the manifest just at all. For example, they did not include children under 4 on pretty much any manifest in the Philippines at this time. They were not considered full passengers. Accounts from survivors that loaded the Doña Paz described the ship being absolutely packed to the railings. It was 4 deep in every single bunk. There was no space to move in common areas. A number of people claim that the ship was actually listing while it was moored because there was so many people getting onto it.
I can see it.
In the Philippines, it was pretty common at this time for crew members to scalp extra tickets, and that's part of why they ended up so overcrowded. If you showed up with cash, there'd be a crew member nearby who would take cash from you and just let you on the boat. It's not an official ticket. It's not on the manifest, but it was a way for them to make some extra money.
That happens all the time, everywhere.
Is that a thing everywhere? Well, that's horrifying.
There was a zoo a little ways.
Oh, everywhere in the Philippines?
The port that we'd pull in the Philippines. Yes. And you could take a picture in front of a cage with a tiger. The tiger's heavily trained. One of my buddies paid extra and got in the cage with it. Ouch. Not supposed to happen, but, drop a little money.
Well, there you go. Like I said, corruption is a big part of this story. And clearly I'm sure the Philippines are an absolutely wonderful place filled with wonderful people. So I'm not trying to hate on Filipinos at all, but there was a lot of corruption. And I'm sure there still is quite a bit.
I think there's a lot of, you do what you need to do, too.
Yes. Eludia Baxal was one of the survivors that made it off the ship. She described the loading and just the general crowdedness of the ship as, quote, there were so many people, we were like cockroaches or ants. There were just so many of us. People were getting restless. Children were crying, and it was very noisy. There were a lot of kids. A lot of kids on this ship because, again, Christmas time. The kitchen and the mess hall was so crowded that most people just didn't get food to eat because it wasn't worth going in there and fighting, particularly people with young children or elderly people. There was also a number of Filipino military members on the boat at this time because, again, they're on leave. They're going home for the holidays. Luzgardo Neto was the only military survivor from the disaster. He estimated that there was at least 1,000 military members on the boat when he got on. A number of other survivors echo him. There were tons of soldiers all over that ship when it took off. So by the time the Doña Paz set sail, there was an estimated somewhere between 4,400 and 4,500 people on this ship that was only supposed to hold about 1,500 and a crew of 54.
That's ridiculous.
Yep. We're starting off super great. The Vector, on the other hand, set sail with a crew of 13. And again, the Vector had 9,000 gallons of gas, kerosene, and oil. The Vector, one of its big problems, the most senior navigator on deck serving as the captain was a seafarer with a license of only second mate. That was the highest level of licensure they had.
What?
Yep. Pretty horrific, right? Now, when these ships set sail on December 20th, both crews were in an incredibly festive mood. There's a number of reports from the Doña Paz passengers who survived that the Doña Paz crew was partying it up. There was literally a whole ass party going on next to the deck, next to the bridge. The crew members were drinking, they were watching movies, they were hanging out. They weren't visibly on the bridge. A number of survivors remember there being maybe one person on the bridge. Maybe.
Yep, that sounds about right, too.
There's varying reports about the captain himself. I read some people saying that they thought he was in his cabin watching Betamax movies. Do you remember Betamax?
Yes.
From way back in the day. Some people said that he was at the party drinking. Everyone agreed, though, he was not on the bridge. He wasn't where he should be. So here we are. We have one incredibly overloaded ship. We have one ship with basically no one fully trained to do what they should be doing. All of the crew members are partying hardy. Both ships are heading through the Tablas Strait. The Doña Paz is going at about 26 kilometers per hour. The Vector going at about 8 kilometers per hour. Neither one of them are going all that fast. On top of that, they are surrounded by 37 kilometers of open water. So there's a ton of space. They're moving very slow. A couple of survivors talk about how the collision happened. My favorite, though, was one guy who was standing on the edge of the Doña Paz peeing, watching the Vector slowly creeped up to the Doña Paz and then struck on the port side right near where the engine room was.
Oh.
And this collision, despite how slow they were going, you might think it would be not that bad.
It's a ton of momentum. So much mass.
And the engine room means power went out immediately on the Doña Paz. 9,000 gallons of flammable liquid means the Vector immediately exploded. It hits the Doña Paz, it blows up, it lights the Doña Paz on fire pretty much immediately, but to make matters even worse, it lit the ocean on fire. This is oil. Oil floats, and oil stays on fire while it's floating. So within seconds, the Doña Paz, most people were asleep because this is 10:30 at night. Giant crash, giant explosion, and now everything is on fire.
Including the water.
The fire quickly spread to over 1 kilometer wide, which is 3,280 feet, just for those of you that don't know the metric system. Survivors very much remember people almost instantaneously catching on fire. The few people who did survive were almost exclusively people who were near or on the deck and as gut instinct jumped off of the ship into the water and swam as fast as they could. That's about it for people that survived.
Yikes.
The people who jumped off and had to swim out, they had to swim under or through fire to get to safety. They couldn't just grab onto debris and float.
Nope.
And fire is hot. So that top layer of water was also quickly starting to boil. So they couldn't just dive low under the fire. They had to go pretty deep to avoid getting boiled alive as well. This is for the people who survived. The people who didn't survive for obvious reasons. One survivor described swimming by a burned child after he escaped the flames. He tried to revive them, but the child was unfortunately deceased. I want you to remember, what do you know about the wildlife in the Philippines, particularly in the water?
I don't go in the water there.
Because it's shark infested. So the water is on fire. It's filled with sharks. You can't really climb on the debris because it's either on fire or it's floating in fire. The ships are sinking. It's not great. Neither ship made a distress call in any way, shape, or form. There was 0 announcements made by the crew. The survivors who talk about what happened talk about crew running around like crazy. All of the life vests were locked up
and
inaccessible to any of the survivors.
What? I mean, floating in the lake of fire wouldn't help.
After the Vector hit the Doña Paz, there was people stampeding down the corridors. A number of them actually tried to go deeper into the ship, thinking that the lower they went, the faster they could escape the fire, or the better they could escape the fire.
No, you're just trapped.
One man who was there with his wife and 2 daughters awoke to the loud explosion while sleeping on a bunk. He is the one who noticed. He's the one who has the report that the life jackets were locked up. He tried to get life jackets for his wife, his kids, and himself, but it was locked and he couldn't. He started to burn and jumped off the ship without thinking. His wife and children didn't survive. He did.
God.
Absolutely awful. Oludia Baksa, the one we talked about earlier, who described the conditions of the ship, she jumped off the ship with her father. Her father is the one who really made her do it. She said, quote, "I could not breathe from the smoke. It was thick and very black. I saw Papa getting ready to jump. I grabbed onto his shoulder and we jumped together." Now, her father was Salvador Basca, and he was a really experienced diver. He knew a lot about water in general, and he knew that a ship fire was not the place to be.
Yeah.
So he basically shoved her off of the ship, but they got separated as soon as they got into the water. Salvador dove very deep, managed to make it pretty far away from the flames, but Oludia was not nearly as strong of a swimmer, so she was going down and up trying to get her way out of the flames, and she ended up with some pretty bad injury. She ended up like losing her eye. She had third-degree burns, but this is a good one. She made it through the fire, and she kept almost drowning. She talked about how she would go under and like try and give up, but she just couldn't. So she would swim back to the surface into the flames, going up and down, until eventually she heard her father calling her name, and she turned and was able to scream for him, and he swam up to her and was able to keep her up out of the water and held her that she didn't end up drowning. And he held her that way for over an hour until the rescue ship that ends up comes.
All right, Dad.
Yeah, Papa Bear nailed it that time. Many of the survivors that were in the water, and again, there's only 26 survivors from this disaster. So when I say many, like it's
only 26.
Take that with a grain of salt that it's worth. They talked about how when they first jumped off the ship, when they first got out of the way of the flaming waters, there was just tons of screaming. You could hear the chaos. It was very reminiscent to what people describe of the Titanic. And then slowly the screams faded away until there was nothing but cackling. Cackling from the fire.
Oh, God.
Crackling from the fire.
Oh,
Sorry.
Someone went insane.
I'm sure there was that too. The MV Don Claudio was nearby. They heard the explosion and they saw a wall of flame go up in the air several hundred meters. They knew something was bad.
Damn.
They did not get a distress call because, again, there was no distress call to anywhere from either ship. But they heard an explosion, they saw the flames, and they thought, we should go check that out. So they headed on over there. They got there as fast as possible, but it took them over an hour. So these people that were in the water were waiting without lifeboats, without life jackets.
Oh, God.
With the water on fire and sharks. By the time they arrived, both ships had sank. The MV Vector sank second. The Doña Paz was down relatively quickly. The Don Claudio managed to rescue 24 of the 26 people who survived this disaster in that moment. One of the other two survivors that made it was actually this little 4-year-old boy. He wasn't found until 2 days later, floating on a door like Jack and Rose from the Titanic. They never released his name, but he floated for 2 days. Absolutely. The Don Claudio had to pull survivors up in nets because they were too weak to climb ropes.
Oh, wow.
Again, this is very similar. It has very Titanic vibes. There's a lot to it that feels like the Titanic.
Yeah, I mean, you're treading water for an hour.
Yeah.
The
Don Claudio also tried to recover some of the bodies, but they were only able to find 108 bodies.
Oh, my God.
The people who were pulled out of the water were almost all just horrifically burned. The descriptions of it were pretty graphic, talking about how survivors were dripping skin as it fell off, slippage. Like I said, Oludia lost her eye. A number of people ended up losing hands and feet and things like that. I mean, very similar to the station fire, 3rd degree and 4th degree burns, except they were also treading water for a couple of hours before they got rescued.
Or munched on by sharks.
Well, we're going to get to that.
Oh, good.
Like I said before, only one of the soldiers survived. That was Luzgardo Neto. And when he talked about all of his fellow military members that went down, he says he assumed they all drowned or got eaten by sharks.
Wow.
So there were 4,386 deaths attributed to it and only 26 survivors. 24 of the survivors were passengers from the Doña Paz and 2 were crew members from the Vector. All of the crew on the Doña Paz died. All but 2 died on the Vector. And the 2 that didn't die on the Vector were asleep at the time of the collision. And that's probably why they survived. Where their quarters were, they were near the deck and they were able to jump and get out relatively quickly compared to other places.
Yeah. They weren't down in the engine room or something like that.
Yeah. Like I said, most of the survivors who made it were the people who just didn't think. They acted. They immediately jumped. There's no survivor stories that I read of people who stayed on the ship for more than like 2 to 3 minutes. So our understanding of what happened on the ship is pretty much limited to what I talked about, where there's people running, there's chaos, there's screaming, and a few of the survivors saw people heading deeper into the ship, presumably to escape the flames. And that's pretty much all we have as a description from what happened on the ship, because no one who stayed on survived, which is just, that hit me pretty hard. In 1987, even though that wasn't the age of cell phones and all that kind of stuff, this is pretty modern. This didn't happen that long ago. And to have very little information about what happened in the disaster because almost no one survived is unique, in my opinion, even in the Philippines, even in, not first world countries. In the Philippines, in any country, there's mandated SAR services. That's search and rescue.
Yep.
Every country has to have a rescue coordination system of some sort in place. In the Philippines, that was the Philippine Rescue Coordinating Center. These rescue organizations or SAR organizations have to have stations that are operated on a 24-hour basis. They have to speak some form of English, which I'm not totally sure why that is.
It's become one of the common languages.
Is it just so that they can ask for help from other agencies?
Yeah, because if you're talking about like along your own coast, you're in charge of rescue for those waters, and it's not just going to be your boats there. It's going to be international.
That makes sense. Okay, yeah. So they have to be able to speak English, and they have to have staff that have a working knowledge of how to rescue people, and they have to have some kind of rescue boat. The Philippine system only had 2 rescue boats at that time.
Oh my God.
However, they had the ability to, and there was channels already there for them to be able to call on the Filipino Air Force, the Navy, and the United States also has a treaty with them that if there's any ships nearby for the Navy or whatever, they will jump in and help with any civilian disasters that happen in the Philippines. So that's who was available for rescue at this point. It's certainly not the best thing out there, but they had access to plenty of tools to be able to do things if anyone had gotten in contact with them.
Exactly.
They didn't hear about the disaster until 8 hours after it happened.
Too late.
There were almost no survivors. I'm not totally sure who told them what happened, but it was considered hearsay, and since it wasn't directly from the ships,
oh my God,
it took a further 8 hours for them to send anyone out to see what happened. The Don Claudio reached Manila before any kind of coordinated effort had started, which meant there was no one there to get the survivors when they got into port. Survivors had to figure out what to do from there.
Oh.
Some of them called family. Some of them took taxis to the hospital. Some of them who had nowhere to go and didn't know what to do ended up at the Department of Welfare, who then directed them where to go. But when there's no rescue operation in place and no one knows what's going on, there was no one there to meet the ship. Insanity. Absolute insanity.
That's horrible.
So when they went out there in force and found no one. Because, of course, there was no one left.
Yeah.
Right? They brought a bunch of helicopters and all this other stuff. They were trying to figure out the area. And from what I can tell, they really didn't do a lot for recovery. There wasn't a super well-organized recovery effort. It makes sense that they couldn't find anyone. What doesn't make a lot of sense to me is how difficult it was for them to get the bodies up and to find them. Because within a couple of hours and over the course of the next several days, hundreds and hundreds of bodies were washing up on beaches throughout the Philippines.
Oh, that's awful.
The Coast Guard seems to have been put in charge of most of the recovery, the Coast Guard that only had 23 ships. So the Coast Guard ended up asking a lot of local fishermen to help because fishermen were already pulling up blackened, charred bodies in their fishing nets and then bringing them back to their villages and burying them because they didn't know what to do with it. And there wasn't any organized place to take these bodies. So the Coast Guard was like, could you keep doing that and just keep burying them? Thanks. This means almost no one was identified. The bodies were just kind of buried on whatever island they either washed up on or fishermen found them.
Wow.
At least 300 of the bodies that were washed up or pulled out of the water were covered in shark bites.
Yep, that makes sense.
So we don't have, none of the 26 people that were pulled out of the water by the Don Claudio were bitten by sharks. So we don't have any firsthand accounts of sharks eating people, but it happened to quite a few of them. And those are only the for sure ones. We don't know if they died from shark bites, if they died from burns, if they died from drowning. We just know that there were 300 bodies.
I'm sure there's no autopsies being done.
No autopsies. There were so many bodies in these towns that diseases started to break out in a number of them.
No.
And again, not much was done by the government. And those people who died from these diseases are not counted as part of the death toll, which I think is kind of crummy. But there we are. So you can imagine the families of these people who died, or even the people who survived, were pissed.
Oh, yeah.
In less than 24 hours, they were lining up outside of Sulpicio lines, literally calling for the heads of the owners of the company. There are a number of videos of this, and while they're all either in Tagalog or Cebuano, which are the two native languages, they're not in English, they had subtitles and you could feel the rage in them. They were screaming things like, "Who do you think you are? Come out here, talk to us, show us the bodies. We know that they're dead, but at least show us the bodies. Where are our dead?" And just screaming at them to at least get these people back home so that they can bury them.
Wow.
Of course, they were sorely disappointed because Sulpicio Lines pretty much immediately blamed Caltex, which were the owners of the MT Vector.
Oh, yeah, it's all their fault.
Yeah, they're saying that, these people were carrying dangerous cargo and it was not a seaworthy vessel, so it's definitely just their fault. Caltex, on the other hand, claimed that the overcrowding on the Doña Paz is the reason why it happened, because the Doña Paz wasn't able to turn. I did not get into all of the problems that these ships had. Throughout the course of, there's a number of inquiries, and I'm just going to kind of go over all of the problems before we talk about the inquiries. During the inquiries, a former captain of the Vector talked about how the ship's rudder was defective. It was one of the reasons why they didn't pass their inspection. It took 2 people to turn the Vector.
Oh my
2
God.
people holding onto the wheel and turning it. So the Vector necessarily sailed in a zigzag pattern, which apparently is just incredibly confusing at night. Because on ships, there's a couple of different lights that are used to let people know where you are. Green light means that you're passing to the right. A red light means that you're passing on the left side. And then a white light means you're going straight on.
Well, so you always have, at night, you always have the running lights, which are the port and starboard, the red and green.
Oh, okay.
And you're only allowed to pass on the green side. You cannot pass on the red side.
But in the Vector's case, what happened was they were zigzagging. The Doña Paz would have seen a red light, then a white light, then a green light, then a white light, then a red light, then a white light, then a green light. And so they never knew what side they were supposed to pass on. That's assuming anyone would have been looking.
Right.
But it made it extra dangerous for anyone sailing near the Vector.
A merchant ship that can't drive in a straight line.
Yep. This is super great. The tanker was effectively unmanned with no one there who had qualifications to do what they were supposed to be doing. The engineer didn't even have a license on the Vector, none at all. It's not that he was under-licensed, he just didn't have one at all. They did not bring a lookout on this sailing. One of the big questions that came up in the inquiry, though, was why the Doña Paz didn't just sail around. With these changing lights and all these different things, there's still 37 kilometers of open water. Could have just sailed around it. They could have just gone really far out of the way and gone around it. And ultimately, the conclusion that most of these inquiries came to is that the bridge was unmanned by the Doña Paz. At best, there was one apprentice seaman on the ship. But realistically, most people think that neither deck was manned at all. There was nobody watching to make sure that they didn't run into anyone.
We got cruise control set.
It was also pretty obvious that none of the radios were working. In all likelihood, somebody would have made some kind of radio call.
But no one did. The other ship.
But even after the ships hit, you have a few minutes and no one called. No one called the other ship. Now, it makes sense that no one would call the other ship if no one's on the bridge to see that we're about to collide. But I feel like there's a good argument for the radios weren't working at all because they didn't call anyone after the ships collided. But I mean, they could have just been running around not knowing what they were doing. We'll never know for
panicked,
sure.
But chances that someone would have thought to try and radio.
I would think so.
Yeah.
But, we'll never know for sure. The Board of Marine Inquiry, the Senate Committee on National Defense, the Coast Guard, and Congress all conducted individual inquiries.
Okay.
And they all came to different conclusions. The congressional probe, the first one, found that both the Doña Paz and the Vector were liable. The Senate blamed both ships. The Filipino Supreme Court ruled that the Vector was liable. And now we're going to talk about the Marine Board. The Marine Board is really the biggie of these things because they actually know what they're doing and what they're talking about. The Marine Board is the department that's over the Coast Guard. Remember that.
All right.
The Marine Board ultimately ruled that the Vector was liable because they didn't have their license. their certificate of inspection.
Right.
No one was trained as well as they should have been trained.
Yep.
And with the testimony that it required 2 people to steer, the vector's liable.
Yeah.
However, they said that the overcrowding didn't happen. They completely dismissed the idea that overcrowding was even a thing.
How?
They just said
What?
It wasn't. They said the Coast Guard counts every single person and makes sure that no ship is
Oh,
overcrowded.
because they covered their
Because
ass.
they covered their
Oh, my God.
This is going to tie into the damages that
Oh.
Sulpicio is
I'm about to
paid
get
out.
mad, aren't I?
Yeah, I mean, you're not mad yet,
More mad.
right? None of these inquiries resulted in any kind of criminal proceedings or any kind of damages. Like, there was no punishments. They were just fact-finding missions.
Okay.
Both bodies of Congress ended up doing their own hearings as well on the safety maritime stuff at this time. And it's pretty obvious that these were just media circuses.
Dog and pony show.
Dog and pony show. However, they did come up with a number of proposals to increase safety by enforcing strict standards, quote unquote.
Right.
But the reality is, once the interest in the disaster died down, none of these were enforced in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
All of this clearly caused a number of protests. People were in the streets, raging mad, and then it just kind of fell off. People stopped talking about it. The protests stopped. It all kind of got forgotten. About a year after the disaster, do you remember me telling you about the Doña Marilyn?
Yes.
The ship that became the new flagship?
Yes.
It sank.
Of course.
They sent it out in a typhoon.
What?
Yep.
Oh, my God.
This is not the first time they do that. This is a sister ship to the Doña Paz. It's the same kind of ship, same everything. It got caught up in a typhoon and sank with 400 dead or missing. Survivors at least were numbered in the 181, so there were more survivors. There were discrepancies in the manifest. It was pretty obvious that the ship was also pretty excessively overcrowded. This time, somebody did try to shut down the line. The president said that Sulpicio Lines is no longer allowed to operate. They're suspended indefinitely.
The president of the Philippines?
The president of the Philippines. Okay. And Sulpicio just ignored him, and then I guess nothing happened. Like, they didn't enforce it at all. They just kept going.
We're not going to do that.
And just nothing.
Nah.
They just said no, which is insane. At the end of the day, Sulpicio Lines was ultimately mandated by the government to pay the families 30,000 pesos.
You're
that comes
fucking
out to
joking.
Be about $500 in United States money today.
It's nothing.
Nothing. This was also only for the victims on the manifest, because we talked about it. The Board of Marine Inquiry said that it wasn't overcrowded. The only people on were the people on the manifest. So only people that were on the manifest were originally allowed to claim their $500. That said,
assholes.
With the number of protests, Sulpicio decided it was in their best interest to open it up. And they ended up allowing around 3,000 people to make claims for their $500.
$500.
$500.
You motherfuckers.
Even with them opening up, a number of families were not able to claim even that pittance because they were so poor they didn't have any kind of documentation that their family was on that ship whatsoever. So they weren't able to claim anything at all. Relatives tried to file a class action claim, but they weren't able to raise the $6 million that's required to file a class action lawsuit in the Philippines.
$6 million. I've been there. There's not a lot of money in the general populace.
There's also not a lot of class action lawsuits.
Probably because it costs $6,000.
Exactly why. So the owners of Doña Paz were involved in 4 deadly shipping accidents that resulted in the death of over 5,000 people in 11 years. December 1987 was 4,386 of the Doña Paz. October 1988, the Maryland sank off Leyte Island or Leyte Province, killing 300 with 100 missing. In 1988, again, another ship. In June 2008, the Princess of the Stars was sent out in a typhoon as well and killed over 800 people.
Now, are these ferries that they're sending out?
Yeah, because Sulpicio is mostly ferries at this point. But they were not put out of business. They're still
so
running
they're not sorting the ships to protect them from getting wrecked in the harbor.
Oh, no.
They're running passage.
Just operating.
Oh, my God.
Hanging out.
It's passengers on board. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So that ship in 2008, the Princess of the Stars, it sank on June 21st, 2008, killed over 800, 500 missing. This one ended up with a number of hearings, court cases. There was actual proceedings that came up against the company.
Okay.
It took forever, but in July of this year, 2024, the lower court overturned a ruling that they weren't liable for that disaster because they had already been found not liable, and the people appealed it. And the company was finally ordered to pay 129 million pesos in damages. This is the first time they were held in any way truly financially responsible. That's still not a lot of money, but it's a lot more than $500 per person.
True.
The Doña Paz, Maryland, and a ton of other disasters that this company helped really facilitate were mentioned in the ruling. And it was basically out there like, you guys are fucked up. You did all of this.
Fucked up repeatedly.
Please stop screwing up. In the years after, the Doña Paz Sulpicio company ended up changing its name, but it is still one of the largest companies.
They'll never notice.
They'll never know.
They'll never know
it's still one of the largest companies in the Philippines. It now runs today under the Philippines Span Asia company. So if you ever see any ships with that on it, that's Sulpicio line. They still have old ships. They still don't do what they're supposed to be doing.
Of course.
None of these issues seem to have really been fixed in any way, shape, or form. The Doña Paz and the Vector were located in April 2019. There's video footage of these wrecks under the water, which is pretty interesting, very Titanic-y.
Uh-huh.
They were found 2,200 meters or 7,200 feet away from each other at about a depth of 500 meters. They're there. Ooh. They're in good condition. They are deep enough that they shouldn't impact shipping, but they never pulled them up. They never really did more.
There's a ton of shipwrecks that have never been raised.
There's a number of them, and there's a number of them specifically in and around the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
Almost none of the ships that I went through here were actually salvaged or raised in any way unless the companies thought they could retrofit them. Because there's a number of ships that sink in the Philippines that do get raised so that they can just be put back into.
Yep. Patched up and sent back out again.
Patched up and sent back out. So yeah, that is the story of the Doña Paz.
Yep.
How do you feel?
Oh, sunk.
Really? This one makes me so sad because no one is held accountable anywhere in any shape or form.
No, that and
it didn't even change laws.
And the families are just
out of luck.
Out of luck.
One of the reasons I really wanted to do this one and do it on the anniversary of the sinking is this is one of those really kind of forgotten about disasters, and I don't think it should be. These families never got what they should have gotten. What they should have gotten is not having their family members killed. But outside of that, there should have been some kind of compensation. Somebody should have been held liable. But as it stands, the owners of the company are still doing whatever the hell they want to do, still making money hand over fist, and the victims' families are still, for the most part, poor and out of luck.
What's hitting me is actually how not surprising that is to me.
Oof, that's painful.
I didn't know the full details of the story, but none of it was surprising. And
I think a lot of us feel that
pretty
way.
Awful.
Because it is, once you start hearing, oh, there's corruption, you're like, oh, well, it makes sense that the little guy died. Bummer. And it should be more than that. I don't know what else we can do besides bring awareness to it, but... So that's my story. I hope everyone enjoyed it. We will be here on Christmas with Aaron's story of the Kursk. And we have social media. If you guys want to follow us, give us a comment, a like, or just watch the On This Day in Catastrophe that I post on X, on Facebook, on Threads, on Blue Sky. Our email is catastrophichroniclespod@gmail.com. If you go to our website, www.catastrophe-chronicles.com, you can find the pod blog, which has little summaries and links or descriptions of all of the sources that I use so you can dive deeper. So with that,
stay safe, everyone.
And stay curious.